A little girl once asked her mother a question that froze the entire world around them. "Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" The woman didn't answer. But before she could even breathe, the child asked something worse. "And if we go back home, will Daddy hit you again?" 20 feet away, a man who had built an empire on fear stopped walking. He had heard screams before. He had heard threats, gunshots, and men begging for mercy. But he had never heard a child whisper something that painful. And that moment would change 4 lives forever. Before we begin, take a second to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us how kindness, courage, and a single choice can change someone's entire life. Now let me tell you what really happened that cold afternoon. The park sat at the edge of Whitmore Heights, an old American neighborhood that had once been comfortable middle class but had slowly faded into something quieter and worn down. The benches were cracked and weathered. The playground paint had peeled away, revealing rusted metal underneath. Fallen leaves from the oak trees scattered across the empty paths, moving slowly whenever the October wind drifted through. It wasn't the kind of park where families laughed anymore. It was the kind of place people came when they had nowhere else to go. That afternoon, a woman named Shelby Pute sat on the farthest bench from the road. She chose that bench on purpose. Because when you sat far from the street, fewer people noticed you. And right now, not being noticed was the only safety she had left. Shelby was 30 years old. Her brown hair hadn't been washed in days, tied back loosely with a rubber band she'd found in her coat pocket. Her jacket was worn thin against the cold, and faint bruises hid beneath the collar of her sweater. But what stood out most were her eyes. They were the tired kind of eyes sleep could never fix. Eyes that came from years of listening for footsteps in the hallway, years of flinching when doors slammed, years of measuring every word because the wrong sentence could make a room explode. Sitting beside her were her daughters. Hadley, 7 years old. Ruthie, 5. They wore mismatched jackets that didn't quite fit the weather. Hadley's pink zip-up was too thin for the cold wind. Ruthie's oversized gray hoodie had once belonged to a neighbor's son. Their shoes were scuffed but clean. Their hair was braided neatly. Shelby had braided it that morning with careful hands. Because no matter how hard life pressed against her, she always braided her daughter's hair. Every morning. It was the one small thing she could control. The one small promise she could keep. In Shelby's coat pocket was $11.40. 9 days earlier, it had been $112. She had taken the money from the kitchen drawer the night she ran. That night still lived inside her mind like a broken photograph. Trent had come home late. Whiskey on his breath. Anger in his voice. The argument had started over nothing. It always did. And then his hand struck her face. That part wasn't new. But this time, the girls had seen it. Hadley screamed. Ruthie stood frozen in the hallway holding her stuffed rabbit. Not crying. Not blinking. Just watching. And something inside Shelby cracked. Not broken. Cracked. Because broken people can't move. But cracked people still can. That night, she grabbed the emergency bag hidden in the back of the closet. 2 changes of clothes. Her ID. A phone charger. And the small stack of cash she had secretly saved for 3 months. She carried Ruthie on her hip, held Hadley's hand, and walked out the front door barefoot at midnight. She never looked back. Now, 9 days later, they sat in a quiet park pretending a gas station food container was a picnic. Ruthie looked down at the styrofoam box resting on Shelby's lap. Inside was cheap rice and beans from the gas station down the street. "Is this a restaurant?" Ruthie asked with complete seriousness. Shelby forced a smile. "It's better than a restaurant," she said softly. "It's a park picnic." Hadley didn't smile. Hadley had eyes that understood too much. She knew picnics didn't happen on cold Tuesday afternoons. She knew restaurants didn't come in gas station boxes. And she knew her mother hadn't slept properly in 4 nights because the back seat of their car didn't recline far enough. The girls ate slowly. Not because they weren't hungry. They were starving. But during the past 9 days they had both learned something without anyone explaining it. Eating slowly made food last longer. And when food lasted longer, Mommy didn't look so scared. Ruthie chewed a tiny bite while watching pigeons walk across the path. Hadley moved the beans around with her fork, building a small circle around the last few bites. Then she looked up. Her voice was quiet. "Mommy, if we eat today, will we starve tomorrow?" Shelby's hand froze. The air changed. It became heavier, like the sky had lowered closer to the earth. She opened her mouth to answer, to say something comforting, something mothers are supposed to say. But before she could speak, Ruthie asked the second question. "And if we go back home?" She paused, innocent and calm. "Will Daddy hit you again?" Shelby pulled both girls into her arms and held them tightly. She didn't answer. She just pressed her lips against Hadley's hair and closed her eyes. 20 feet behind them, a man had stopped walking. Grady Ashworth was 61 years old. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark wool coat that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Men across 3 counties feared his name. He owned companies, controlled businesses, and had the kind of influence that made powerful people answer his calls. But at that moment, he wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking about a memory he had buried 40 years ago. A small kitchen in Decatur, Georgia. His mother holding frozen peas against a swollen cheek, whispering softly to him, "Don't tell anyone, baby, we're fine." Grady hadn't thought about that moment in decades, until he heard a 5-year-old girl ask if her father would hit her mother again. He stood still beside the gravel path, watching the mother hold her daughters, watching the older girl scan the park like someone waiting for danger. And slowly, something long buried inside him began to wake up. Grady Ashworth reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. He typed a single message to a man named Sullivan. "Stay close." Then he slipped the phone away. And for the first time since entering the park, he started walking toward the bench. Shelby noticed him immediately. Not because he made noise. Not because he moved quickly. But because women who had lived with danger long enough learned to feel it before they saw it. The shift in the air. The weight of footsteps. The presence of someone standing a little too close. Shelby turned her head slightly. The man in the dark coat had stopped about 6 feet from the bench. He wasn't towering over them. He wasn't leaning in. He simply stood there with both hands visible at his sides, his posture calm and controlled. Still, Shelby's arms tightened around her daughters without her thinking about it. "We're fine," she said quickly. The words slipped out before she even realized she had spoken. It was the same sentence she had said 100 times before. To neighbors. To teachers. To doctors who had quietly asked about bruises. "We're fine." The oldest lie in the world. The man didn't argue with her. He didn't step closer either. Instead, he glanced briefly at the girls and then back toward the empty path ahead, as if giving them space. "Your girls look cold," he said quietly. Shelby forced a small smile. "They're okay." His eyes shifted toward Ruthie. "The little one's sleeves are too long," he said. "She keeps pushing them back so she can hold her fork." Shelby blinked. She looked down. Ruthie was indeed fighting with the oversized sleeves of the gray hoodie, rolling them up again so her small hands could reach the plastic fork. Shelby hadn't even noticed. That realization stung more than anything the stranger had said, because 9 days of exhaustion had begun to blur everything. The man nodded toward the path behind him. "There's a diner 2 blocks east of here," he said. "Callahan's. They serve real food." Shelby's jaw tightened. "We're okay," she repeated. "I know you are," the man replied calmly. The answer surprised her. Most people argued when she refused help. Most people insisted. He didn't. Instead, he said something different. "I'd like to buy your girls dinner." Shelby's eyes narrowed slightly. "We don't need." "I didn't say you needed it." His voice remained even. "I asked if you'd accept it." The distinction settled into the air between them. Need, accept. 2 very different things. Shelby studied him carefully now. She had become good at reading men. It was a skill she never wanted but had been forced to learn. She watched his hands, his shoulders, his eyes. She searched for that look she had seen so many times before. Control. Expectation. The silent message that help always came with a price. But she didn't see that. What she saw instead made her uneasy in a different way. Recognition. Like this man understood something he shouldn't. "Why?" Shelby asked quietly. The man looked at the girls again. Hadley was watching him carefully now, her eyes sharp and alert. Ruthie was still focused on the pigeons. "Because once," he said slowly, "I asked my mother a question like that." He paused. "And nobody stopped." The wind moved through the trees above them. Dry leaves scraped across the pavement. For a long moment no one spoke. Shelby felt something inside her chest loosen just slightly. Not trust. Not yet. But something close to it. She looked at Hadley. Hadley looked back at her. The silent conversation between mother and daughter passed in a single glance. Then Shelby gave a small nod. "Okay," she whispered. They walked the 2 blocks slowly. The girls stayed close to Shelby, one on each side. The man walked ahead of them, leaving several steps of space between them. He never once turned around to rush them. That detail did not go unnoticed. Callahan's Diner sat on the corner of Whitmore and 7th. A small brick building with fogged windows and a bell above the door that rang when it opened. Inside, the air smelled like coffee and butter. Warm. Comforting. The kind of smell that made you realize how cold you had been. The waitress looked up from the counter when they entered. Her eyes landed on the man first. Something in her expression changed immediately. Not fear. Recognition. The quiet kind people showed when someone important walked into a room. "Evenin', Mr. Ashworth," she said. Grady Ashworth gave a small nod. "Booth in the back, Linda." She grabbed a few menus and led them to a corner booth beside the window. Shelby slid into the seat with the girls beside her. Grady sat across from them. Ruthie stared at the menu like it was a treasure map. "Mommy," she whispered excitedly, "they have pancakes." Shelby smiled faintly. "You can have pancakes." "And eggs." "And eggs." Hadley didn't open the menu. She kept looking at Grady. Her eyes held the same cautious intelligence he had noticed in the park. Finally she asked the question. "Are you going to hurt us?" Shelby's hand immediately moved toward her daughter's arm. "Hadley." But Grady gently raised one hand. Not a command. Just a quiet pause. He looked directly at the girl. "No," he said calmly. "I'm not going to hurt you." His voice didn't rise or soften. It stayed steady. "I'm not going to hurt your mother either." Hadley didn't blink. "And if you want to leave," he added, "you can walk out that door right now. I won't stop you." The girl studied him for a long moment. Then she slowly opened the menu. Linda returned with a notepad. "What can I get you folks?" "Pancakes and eggs for her," Shelby said, nodding toward Ruthie. "A grilled cheese and tomato soup," Hadley added quietly. Linda smiled. And for you, honey? Shelby hesitated. Grady spoke before she could refuse. A club sandwich, he said. And coffee. Shelby looked at him. You should eat too, he added simply. When the waitress left, silence filled the booth. Outside, the evening sky was turning gray. Inside, the warmth of the diner wrapped around them like a blanket. For the first time in days, Shelby felt her shoulders lower slightly. Grady rested his hands calmly on the table. He didn't ask questions. He didn't pressure her. He simply waited. And after a long moment, Shelby finally spoke. We left 9 days ago, she said quietly. Her eyes stayed on the table. My husband. Her voice faltered. Grady didn't interrupt, but his jaw tightened slightly as he listened. And Shelby slowly began telling the truth she had carried alone for years. The truth about Trent. The hitting. The fear. The night everything changed. And as the words began to spill out, something dark and dangerous started forming behind Grady Ashworth's quiet gray eyes. Shelby kept her eyes on the table as she spoke. My husband. Trent, she said quietly. He didn't start out like that. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the menu in front of her. He used to be charming. Funny. The kind of man who made everyone laugh at parties. My friends used to say I was lucky. She gave a faint, humorless smile. That word, lucky. Grady remained silent, but he was listening to every syllable. Shelby's voice stayed low, careful, almost like she was afraid the memories themselves might hear her. The first time he hit me was 3 months after we got married. She paused. The waitress arrived with the food just then, sliding plates across the table. The smell of pancakes and melted butter drifted through the air. Ruthie's eyes widened with pure amazement. These are huge, she whispered. Shelby forced a small smile toward her daughter. Eat, baby. Ruthie didn't need to be told twice. She immediately cut into the pancakes, syrup dripping across the plate. Hadley picked up her grilled cheese but kept listening. Shelby continued speaking, almost like the words had finally found a door and were rushing through it. It was dinner, she said. I'd burned the chicken. Just a little. He slapped me across the face like it was nothing. Her hand lifted unconsciously, touching the side of her cheek as if remembering the sting. I told myself it was stress. That it wouldn't happen again. Grady's hand slowly curled into a fist on the table. Shelby kept going. But it did. Her voice remained calm, but the calm carried weight. Then it was pushing. Then grabbing my arm hard enough to bruise. Then punching walls beside my head. She swallowed. And eventually, punching me. Ruthie hummed happily to herself while eating pancakes, unaware of the conversation drifting above her. Hadley dipped a corner of grilled cheese into the tomato soup. Her eyes stayed on the bowl. But she was listening. 5 years, Shelby said softly. That's how long I told myself I could control it. Grady finally spoke. You can't control a man like that. Shelby looked at him. I know that now. Her voice cracked just slightly. But when you're inside it, you start believing crazy things. You think if you say the right words, if you keep the house quiet, if you don't make him angry. Her voice faded. You think you can manage the storm. She looked toward her daughters. But storms don't care about management. The diner grew quiet around them. Coffee cups clinked somewhere behind the counter. A man coughed at another booth. Normal sounds. Normal life. Things Shelby hadn't felt part of in a long time. The night we left, she said slowly, he came home drunk. Her breathing grew heavier. He didn't even remember why he was mad. Grady watched her carefully. And this time, Shelby continued, The girls were there. Hadley's hand paused over the soup. Shelby's eyes filled with tears. She didn't bother hiding anymore. He hit me so hard I fell against the kitchen table. Her voice trembled now. And Hadley screamed. Hadley's face remained still, but her fingers tightened around the grilled cheese. Ruthie was standing in the hallway holding her stuffed rabbit, Shelby said. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just watched. Grady felt something inside his chest twist sharply. Shelby wiped her eyes. That's when I realized something. Her voice dropped to a whisper. If I stayed, they'd grow up thinking that was normal. Grady nodded slowly. Shelby continued. So I grabbed the emergency bag I'd been hiding in the closet. Hadley looked up now. You packed that a long time ago, she said quietly. Shelby gave her a sad smile. 3 months before we left. Hadley nodded slowly, almost like she had suspected that. I carried Ruthie on my hip, Shelby said. And I held Hadley's hand. She looked down at the table again. We walked out the door at midnight. Grady asked quietly, Where did you go? I drove. Where? I didn't know, Shelby admitted. I just kept driving. She laughed softly. That's how we ended up in this city. Ruthie lifted her head suddenly. These pancakes are the best pancakes in the whole world, she announced proudly. Grady looked at her. For the first time since sitting down, a faint smile touched his face. I'm glad you like them. Ruthie nodded enthusiastically before returning to her food. Shelby's smile faded again. I tried shelters, she said. They were full. Her voice carried exhaustion. So we slept in the car. Grady's expression darkened. For 9 nights. Shelby nodded. The back seat. She glanced at Hadley. She sleeps sitting up now. Grady looked at the girl. Hadley didn't react, like it was simply a fact of life. Shelby took a slow breath. There's something else. Her voice became even quieter. Trent called the police. Grady's eyes sharpened. He told them I kidnapped the girls. The words hung heavy in the air. He told them I'm mentally unstable, Shelby continued. There's a report filed. Child Protective Services is looking for me. Her hands trembled now. If they find me... She stopped. Grady finished the thought silently. They'll take the girls. Shelby whispered it anyway. They'll send them back to him. The diner suddenly felt smaller. More fragile. Grady stared at the table for a moment. Then he slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Shelby watched him. What are you doing? She asked softly. Grady didn't look up as he scrolled through a contact list. Fixing a problem. Shelby's voice tightened. You can't fix this. Grady finally lifted his eyes. There was something different in them now. Cold. Focused. Yes, he said quietly. I can. Shelby shook her head. You don't understand Trent. Grady leaned back slightly in the booth. No, he said. I understand him perfectly. Shelby stared at him, confused. Grady's thumb pressed the call button. The phone rang once. Then a voice answered. Sullivan. Grady's gaze moved briefly toward Shelby and the girls. I need a room, he said calmly. A safe one. There was a short pause. For how long? Sullivan asked. Grady watched Shelby carefully as he replied. Long enough to change someone's life. Sullivan didn't ask many questions. He never had. On the other end of the phone, his voice remained calm and direct. What kind of room? Private, Grady said. Quiet. Somewhere no one asks questions. A short pause followed. I know a place, Sullivan replied. Western Arms. 4th floor suites. Discreet. Grady glanced across the booth at Shelby and the girls. That'll work. How long? 2 weeks to start. Another pause. Sullivan understood what that meant. 2 weeks in Grady Ashworth's world was never just 2 weeks. It meant a window of time where pieces were being moved into place. I'll handle it, Sullivan said. Grady ended the call and placed the phone back into his coat pocket. Shelby stared at him. Her voice was quiet but tense. You didn't have to do that. Grady leaned back slightly. Yes, he said calmly. I did. Shelby shook her head slowly. You don't know us. I know enough. Hadley watched him carefully from across the table. You're rich, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was simply a fact. Grady looked at her. I've done all right. Hadley dipped another piece of grilled cheese into the soup. Rich people don't usually help poor people, she said. Shelby opened her mouth to correct her daughter, embarrassed. But Grady spoke first. Sometimes they do. Hadley shrugged slightly. Not usually. Grady couldn't argue with that. Shelby took a slow breath. You still don't understand the situation, she said quietly. Grady's eyes moved back to her. Then explain it. Shelby hesitated. Her instinct still told her to stay silent, to protect the truth the way abused people learn to do. But something about this man made silence feel pointless. He's dangerous, she said softly. Grady didn't react. Shelby continued. Trent isn't just angry. He's obsessive. Her voice lowered further. He tracks things. Phone records. Bank cards. Cameras. He always has to know where everyone is. Grady listened carefully. That's why I used cash when we left, Shelby said. That's why I turned off my phone. Hadley looked up slightly. And that's why Mommy never lets us say our last name out loud. Grady's eyes flickered. Shelby nodded slowly. He has money too, she added. Grady finally leaned forward a little. How much? Enough to hire lawyers. That answer told him plenty. Shelby looked at the table again. He's already called the police, she repeated. If they find us, they'll believe him first. Grady's voice stayed steady. Not if someone better is speaking for you. Shelby looked up. What does that mean? Grady reached into his coat pocket again and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts briefly. Then he spoke another name. Margaret Calloway. Shelby frowned. Who's that? The best family attorney in this state. Shelby immediately shook her head. I can't afford someone like that. You don't have to. Shelby's voice tightened. I'm not taking charity. Grady met her eyes calmly. It's not charity. Then what is it? Grady leaned back again. Consider it unfinished business. Shelby didn't understand that answer. But before she could ask anything else, Ruthie pushed her empty plate forward proudly. I ate all my pancakes. Grady glanced down at the plate. You sure did. Ruthie smiled wide. Can we come here again tomorrow? Shelby gently wiped syrup from her daughter's cheek. We'll see. Ruthie leaned back in the booth, completely satisfied. Hadley finished the last bite of her grilled cheese and placed the sandwich crust carefully on the plate. You didn't answer my question earlier, she said to Grady. What question? Why you stopped. Grady looked at her. In the park. Hadley's eyes stayed fixed on him. You heard what I asked Mommy. Grady nodded once. Yes. Hadley waited. Why did you care? The diner hummed quietly around them. Grady looked down at his hands for a moment. For most people, he was a wall. A man who showed nothing. But something about that question reached past the wall. My mother, he said slowly, used to say the same thing your mom says. Hadley tilted her head slightly. What thing? That everything was fine. He looked at Shelby briefly. Even when it wasn't. Shelby's breathing slowed as she listened. Grady's voice remained low. I used to sit in the hallway when I was your age. Hadley didn't interrupt. I'd hear my father yelling, Grady continued. Hear things breaking. His eyes drifted somewhere far away. And afterward, my mother would sit at the kitchen table with frozen peas against her face. Ruthie listened now too. She always said the same thing, Grady added quietly. What? Ruthie asked. Grady looked at her. We're fine. Ruthie frowned. But she wasn't fine. No, Grady said softly. She wasn't. The booth fell silent. For a moment, the distance between rich and poor, powerful and powerless, seemed to fade. Shelby finally spoke. What happened to her? Grady's expression hardened slightly. She worked 2 jobs. His voice was steady again. She kept going until her body couldn't any more. Shelby understood what that meant without asking. Hadley spoke again. And no one helped? Grady shook his head slowly. No one stopped. Hadley absorbed that quietly. Then she said something that made the entire table go still. But you did. Grady looked at her. You stopped. For the first time in years, those words hit somewhere deep inside him. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached for his coffee and took a slow sip. Shelby studied him carefully. Something had changed in the air between them. Not trust yet, but something close to hope. Then Grady's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A message from Sullivan. Room secured. 4th floor. Key ready. Grady slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked across the table. The room's ready, he said. Shelby's heart skipped slightly. What room? Grady stood from the booth. A safe one. Shelby hesitated. Every instinct she had built over 5 years screamed at her to be careful. But she also looked at her daughters. At Ruthie's syrup-covered smile. At Hadley's tired eyes. And she realized something painful. They couldn't survive another 9 nights in the car. Shelby slowly stood up. Grady pulled a few bills from his wallet and placed them on the table. More than enough to cover the meal. Then he looked at Shelby. You don't have to decide anything tonight, he said quietly. Shelby held Hadley's hand. Ruthie grabbed the edge of her jacket. Grady walked toward the door first. When he opened it, cold evening air rushed inside. Shelby stood still for a moment. Then Hadley squeezed her hand gently. Mom, she whispered. Shelby looked down. Hadley's voice was calm. He stopped. Shelby took a breath. Then she followed Grady out into the night. Cold air wrapped around them the moment they stepped outside the diner. The warmth of Callahan's faded quickly behind them as the door closed and the bell above it gave a soft chime. Shelby instinctively pulled Ruthie's hood up over her head and tightened her own jacket around her shoulders. Grady stood a few steps ahead on the sidewalk, his dark coat unmoving in the wind. He didn't rush them. He simply waited. Cars passed slowly along Whitmore Street, headlights sliding across the pavement like quiet waves. Hadley stayed close to Shelby's side, her small hand still wrapped firmly around her mother's fingers. Ruthie bounced lightly beside them, still energized by pancakes and warmth. Where's the room? Hadley asked. Grady nodded toward the far end of the block. Not far. They began walking. The streets were quieter now, the sky deepening into a dim gray evening. Storefront lights flickered on one by one. Shelby noticed something about the way Grady moved. He walked with calm certainty, like a man who never had to look over his shoulder. It was a kind of confidence she hadn't seen in years. The kind Trent had once pretended to have, before it turned into control. Grady stopped at the corner and pressed a button at the crosswalk. The signal blinked red. Ruthie tugged at Shelby's sleeve. "Mommy." "Yes, baby?" "Are we going somewhere fancy?" Shelby glanced ahead uncertainly. "I don't know." Grady overheard. "It's not fancy," he said. Ruthie's face brightened. "Good. Fancy places don't let kids touch things." Hadley glanced up at him. "Are you rich?" she asked. Shelby sighed softly. "Hadley." "It's okay," Grady said. He looked down at the girl. "I've got money." Hadley nodded thoughtfully. "My dad always said rich people don't help people like us." Shelby stiffened slightly at the mention of Trent. Grady didn't react right away. They crossed the street together. Finally he said quietly, "Your dad said a lot of things that weren't true." Hadley didn't answer, but the silence between them felt thoughtful rather than tense. They walked another block before stopping in front of a tall brick building. The sign above the entrance read Western Arms. It wasn't a luxury hotel, but it was clean, solid, and well-lit. Shelby studied the building carefully. Something about it felt safe. Grady stepped inside first and held the door open. Warm air flowed out to meet them. Inside, the lobby was simple but tidy. A man behind the desk looked up immediately. His eyes moved to Grady. "Evening, Mr. Ashworth." Grady gave a small nod. Sullivan called ahead. The clerk reached under the counter and pulled out a key-card envelope. "4th floor suite." He slid it across the desk. "No paperwork needed." Shelby felt her stomach tighten. "No paperwork?" Grady picked up the envelope. "Discretion is part of what people pay for here." He handed the key-card to Shelby. For a moment she just stared at it. A simple piece of plastic. But it felt heavier than it should. "You're giving this to me?" she asked quietly. Grady nodded once. "It's your room." Shelby's throat tightened. "For how long?" 2 weeks to start." Shelby shook her head slightly. "That's too much." Grady's voice remained calm. "It's time." Hadley leaned closer to Shelby and whispered, "Mom, please." Shelby looked down at her daughters. 9 nights in the car. 9 nights of cold air and stiff seats and pretending everything was okay. She slowly closed her fingers around the keycard. "Thank you," she said quietly. Grady nodded toward the elevator. The ride to the 4th floor was silent. Ruthie watched the numbers above the door like it was a game. 3, she whispered. Then the elevator dinged. 4. The hallway outside was quiet, carpeted, and softly lit. Grady walked ahead until he reached a door near the end. Shelby stepped forward and slid the card into the lock. The small green light blinked. The door clicked open. Shelby pushed it slowly. The room was simple but clean. 2 beds with white sheets. A small couch. A table by the window. A kitchenette with a microwave and mini fridge. But the most important thing in the room was something Shelby hadn't had in 9 days. A door that locked. Ruthie ran inside first. She jumped onto one of the beds and bounced lightly. "It's so soft." Hadley stepped in more carefully, looking around with wide eyes. Shelby walked slowly across the room. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table, the back of the chair, the smooth counter of the kitchenette. Real furniture. Real safety. Her chest tightened suddenly. Grady stayed by the door. "You'll have privacy here," he said. Shelby turned back toward him. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to." "But—" "Use the time," Grady said quietly. Shelby hesitated. "For what?" Grady met her eyes. For fixing what that man tried to break. Shelby looked down for a moment. And the lawyer you mentioned? Margaret Calloway, Grady said. She'll call tomorrow morning. Shelby blinked. You already arranged that? Grady simply nodded. Shelby laughed softly in disbelief. You move fast. When something needs doing, he replied. Ruthie bounced again on the bed. Mommy! Look! Shelby turned just in time to see her daughter flop backward into the pillows. The little girl stared up at the ceiling, smiling. Can I sleep laying down tonight? The question struck Shelby like a wave. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then she walked across the room and sat beside her daughter. Yes, she whispered. Yes, baby. Ruthie curled onto her side happily. Hadley climbed onto the other bed and sat quietly. Shelby stood again and walked to the door. She turned the deadbolt. The heavy metal clicked into place. The sound echoed softly through the room. Shelby closed her eyes. For 9 days she had listened for danger every minute. Now, for the first time, there was a barrier between them and the world. When she opened her eyes again, Grady was still standing near the doorway. You should get some rest, he said. Shelby nodded slowly. Grady stepped back into the hallway. Before the door closed, Hadley spoke. Mr. Ashworth? He paused. Yes. Hadley looked at him seriously. Thank you for stopping. Grady held her gaze for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. The door closed gently. Shelby leaned against it for a moment, listening to the quiet. But 3 floors below, outside the building, a dark sedan slowly rolled past the entrance. Inside the car, a man glanced up toward the 4th floor windows. And for a brief second, he picked up his phone. Inside the dark sedan, the man in the driver's seat lowered his phone slowly after finishing the call. He kept his eyes on the 4th floor windows of the Western Arms for a few more seconds. The building looked quiet. Ordinary. Just another place in the city where people came and went without being noticed. But the man's instincts told him something different. He tapped the steering wheel once with his fingers, thinking. Then he started the engine again and pulled away from the curb. Across the street, another vehicle sat parked in shadow. Inside it, Sullivan watched the sedan disappear down the block. He had noticed it the moment it rolled past the building. Sullivan had worked for Grady long enough to recognize the difference between coincidence and curiosity. And that car had been watching. He picked up his phone. Yeah, Grady answered. You might want to know, Sullivan said calmly. We had a visitor. There was a pause. What kind? Dark sedan. Slowed down outside the Western Arms. Driver made a call. Grady's voice stayed quiet. You get the plate? Already did. Another pause followed. Good, Grady said. Keep an eye on it. Sullivan leaned back slightly in the seat. You think it's him? Grady didn't answer immediately. But when he did, his tone carried quiet certainty. Men like Trent don't sit still when they lose control. Sullivan nodded to himself. I'll handle it. He ended the call and stayed where he was, watching the street. Upstairs, the room on the 4th floor had gone completely still. Shelby sat on the edge of Ruthie's bed. The little girl had fallen asleep almost instantly, curled under the blanket with one arm wrapped around a pillow. For a moment Shelby simply watched her. 9 days of fear had made sleep light and restless for the girls. But tonight Ruthie was breathing deeply, peacefully. Shelby brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's forehead. Sleep, baby, she whispered. Across the room, Hadley sat cross-legged on the other bed. She wasn't asleep. She was watching the door. Shelby noticed. You're safe here, Shelby said softly. Hadley nodded, but her eyes stayed serious. I know. Shelby walked over and sat beside her. The mattress dipped slightly. Hadley's voice came out quiet. "You believe him?" Shelby hesitated. The question carried more weight than a child should ever have to ask. "I think he means what he says," Shelby answered slowly. Hadley looked down at her hands. "People mean things sometimes," she said. "Then they change." Shelby felt a small ache in her chest. Hadley had learned too much too early. "Not everyone," Shelby said gently. Hadley glanced toward the door. "He looked angry when you told him about Dad." Shelby nodded. "Yes. Is that bad?" Shelby thought about Grady's eyes at the diner. The way something cold had moved behind them when Trent's name came up. "No," she said quietly. "Sometimes anger means someone cares." Hadley absorbed that for a moment. Then she lay down slowly on the bed. Shelby pulled the blanket up over her. "Mom?" "Yes." Hadley's voice softened. "Are we really not going back?" Shelby brushed her daughter's hair back. "No. Ever." Shelby took a breath. "Ever." Hadley's shoulders relaxed just slightly. Within a few minutes, she drifted off to sleep. Shelby sat between the two beds for a long time. The room hummed quietly with the low sound of the heater. Outside the window, faint city lights flickered against the glass. Shelby leaned back against the wall and closed her eyes. For the first time in days, she let herself breathe all the way in. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound still made her ears sharpen. A car passing outside. A door closing somewhere down the hall. Years of living with fear didn't disappear overnight. Eventually, Shelby stood and walked toward the small kitchenette. She poured a glass of water and stared out the window. Her reflection in the glass barely looked like the woman she remembered being 5 years ago. But something was different tonight. Something small but real. Hope. Across the city, Grady Ashworth sat in the back office of a quiet building. The room was dim except for a single lamp on his desk. Files and folders lay spread out in front of him. Sullivan had already sent information. A background report on Trent Pute. Grady flipped through the pages slowly. Employment history. Financial records. Police complaints that had never turned into charges. Patterns. Control. Temper. Everything about the man fit the profile Grady expected. His jaw tightened as he read. The final page held something interesting. 2 recent phone calls logged earlier that evening. One to a private investigator. The other to someone listed only as Carter. Grady leaned back in his chair. That name meant something. He reached for the phone and dialed Sullivan again. "Yeah." Sullivan answered. "You know a Carter tied to Trent Pute?" A short pause. "Unfortunately, yeah." Grady's eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Local muscle," Sullivan said. "The kind guys like Trent hire when they want problems solved quietly." Grady looked down at the file again. "What kind of problems?" "The kind where someone disappears." The room went silent for a moment. Grady stood up slowly. His chair scraped softly against the floor. "That's not happening," he said. Sullivan's voice remained steady. "What's the move?" Grady walked toward the window of his office and looked out at the dark city. "Find Carter. And Trent." Grady's voice dropped slightly. "Men like him only feel powerful when they think no one is watching." Sullivan understood immediately. "So we start watching." Grady nodded slowly. "Exactly." He ended the call and stared out into the night. Far across the city, in a small room on the 4th floor of the Western Arms, 2 little girls slept peacefully for the first time in days. But somewhere else in the same city, another man had already started looking for them. Somewhere in the city that night, Trent Pute was awake. He sat in his living room surrounded by broken glass from the kitchen window he had shattered earlier that evening. The house was quiet. Too quiet. For 9 days he had told himself Shelby would come back. They always came back. Fear had a way of pulling people home. But tonight something felt different. His phone rested in his hand as he stared at the contact labeled Carter. The call had already been made. Now he waited. Across town, Carter leaned against the hood of a truck outside a dim bar, finishing a cigarette. His phone buzzed again. "Yeah," Carter answered. Trent's voice came through tense and sharp. "Did you find anything?" Carter exhaled smoke slowly. "Got a location lead." Trent sat up straighter. "Where?" "Hotel on Whitmore," Carter said. "Western Arms." Trent's jaw tightened. "So they're there." "Looks that way." Trent's voice darkened. "I want them brought home." Carter flicked the cigarette to the pavement. "Kidnapping charges already filed," he said casually. "Police will handle that part." Trent's tone hardened. "No," he said quietly. "I want it handled tonight." Carter paused. That kind of request carried weight. "All right," Carter muttered. "I'll take a drive." Back across the city, Sullivan's phone buzzed in the parked car outside the Western Arms. He answered instantly. "You were right," the voice on the other end said. Sullivan straightened. "Carter's on the move." Sullivan's eyes lifted toward the building again. The fourth-floor window glowed softly with light. Inside that room were 2 sleeping girls and a mother who had finally locked a door between them and fear. "Not tonight," Sullivan murmured. He ended the call and dialed Grady. "He's coming," Sullivan said. Grady's voice remained calm. "Let him." Minutes later, Carter's truck rolled slowly onto Whitmore Street. He parked across from the Western Arms and stepped out. The street looked quiet. Ordinary. He crossed toward the entrance. But before he reached the door, a voice spoke behind him. "You looking for someone?" Carter turned. Grady Ashworth stood a few feet away beneath the streetlight. Hands in his coat pockets. "Come." Carter studied him. "And you are?" Grady didn't answer the question. "You've got the wrong building," he said evenly. Carter chuckled lightly. "I'm pretty sure I don't." Grady stepped closer. Not aggressive. Just present. "You're done here." Carter's smile faded slightly. "You telling me where I can go now?" Grady's voice stayed quiet. "I'm telling you that the woman upstairs and her daughters are under my protection." Carter stared at him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. "You don't even know them." Grady's expression didn't change. "I know enough." Carter glanced toward the building. "Her husband says she kidnapped those kids." Grady's eyes hardened. "Her husband is a liar." Carter laughed again, though it sounded less confident now. "Look, man. I've got a job." Grady stepped closer until they stood only a few feet apart. "And I've got a promise." The street fell quiet around them. Cars passed somewhere in the distance. Carter studied Grady's face carefully now. Something about the man's calm unsettled him. "You really willing to make this your problem?" Carter asked. Grady's answer came without hesitation. "Already did." Carter glanced around the empty street. Then back at Grady. Finally he sighed and raised his hands slightly. "Not worth it." He stepped backward toward his truck. "Tell Trent I stopped by." Grady didn't move. "I will." Carter climbed into the truck and drove away. Sullivan stepped out from the shadows near the corner. "You think he'll stay gone?" Grady watched the taillights disappear down the road. "Yes," he said. "And Trent?" Grady's voice carried quiet certainty. "The law will handle him." Weeks passed. Margaret Calloway worked quickly. Protective orders were filed. Evidence surfaced. Hospital records. Witness statements. Photographs Shelby had once hidden in a locked drawer. The truth that had lived in silence for years finally stood in the open. And when the court reviewed everything, the decision came clearly. Shelby Pute was granted full custody. The charges Trent filed collapsed under their own lies. For the first time in years, Shelby walked out of a courthouse without fear behind her. Life began slowly rebuilding. A small apartment on the west side of the city. 2 beds in a quiet bedroom. A kitchen table where pancakes were made on Sunday mornings. Hadley started 2nd grade at a nearby school. Ruthie decorated her wall with bright stickers and drawings. And one cold afternoon months later, Shelby returned to Callahan's diner with the girls. They slid into the same booth by the window. Pancakes for Ruthie. Grilled cheese and soup for Hadley. A club sandwich for Shelby. But this time Shelby ate the whole sandwich. No wrapping half for later. Hadley stirred her soup thoughtfully. "Mom," she said. "Yes." "Do you think Mr. Ashworth knew we'd be okay?" Shelby smiled softly. "I think he hoped." Ruthie held up a drawing she had made. 3 figures standing in front of a small apartment building with a tree. Above them she had written one word. Home. Shelby looked at it for a long time. Then she pulled both girls close. And in that quiet booth, surrounded by the simple warmth of ordinary life, she realized something powerful. The world had not suddenly become safe. But sometimes, all it took was one person who refused to walk past pain. One person who stopped. One person who believed kindness mattered more than pride, and protection mattered more than power. Because the truth is simple. Love protects. Kindness saves. And sometimes the strongest people in the world are the ones who choose to care. If this story touched your heart, consider subscribing to the channel. And tell us in the comments which region of the world you're watching from.